Welcome to another episode of Agile Done Right. I'm your host, Michael Renna. Today, we're going to jump into a topic called Debunking Agile Myths and Misconceptions. It's been my experience over the 25 years that I've been doing this that Agile is a word that's often misunderstood. In fact, most companies, while claiming to be Agile, may only scratch the surface on the practices and principles that make Agile the most commonly adopted practice for delivering software or technology solutions. In fact, most companies will say, yeah, we're Agile, and perhaps that only means they have daily stand-ups or some of the superficial ceremonies, but don't really understand what it means to adopt Agile fully. So today I want to talk about 4 or 5 myths that have been pervasive in my career that have come up often, and I want to try to answer many of those directly with some experience and hopefully some insight on those things and how they exist in the real world. I also want to take a stab at responding to some of the Agile criticisms. So the first, we'll talk about myths, these things that people maybe believe erroneously about Agile practice. And when I say Agile practice, I'm really talking now about really any of the primary methodologies, whether it's Scrum or Kanban, extreme programming, versions of scaling Agile like SAFe or less. All of those things have just fundamentals in common. And I think the criticisms and the myths that exist around Agile apply to all of them. So we're not going to specifically look at a specific methodology, although I will talk a little bit about SAFe before the episode's over. I want to talk through a post that we had within a company early in a transformation where someone was taking some real shots at SAFe. And so I want to talk about that too. So we will get a little bit specific around some criticisms on SAFe and how I would respond to some of those and what I think they really mean, what was really being said, and what's the sort of the concerns really are when you start to dive in and sort of peel the onion a little bit. So we'll get to that a bit, but we're going to start with some of the myths, and I want to talk through my impression of why some of these myths exist and really and how I would personally debunk them based on my experience and some of the education I've had over the years. So let me take you through what these myths are. Right? The first one is Agile means no planning. And then we'll talk about Agile is only for software development. And the third myth I'm going to debunk is Agile means no documentation. And then myth number 4 is Agile is chaotic and unstructured. So those are the 4 myths we're going to take on here today. So let's jump right in. The first myth, Agile means no planning. Right? I do hear that a lot. And there's always a concern from senior leadership. I think, well, we're just going to turn people loose. Agile teams are just out there winging it, and we don't have any real predictability, and we have sort of no idea what they're doing. Are they working hard? Are they productive? And when are we going to get the things that we are needing? Right? When are we going to get the innovation that we need to deliver to our customers to stay competitive and be successful? So clearly all these myths from my perspective are false. Agile means no planning is not true. In fact, Agile means more planning. So Agile ceremonies typically are repeatable, shorter increments that allow for really the expected variability that exists in doing anything creative, right? Most things that we're building, if we are innovative, are things that no one has built before. And so there's a certain level of mystery and uncertainty around that. And so in fact, these short cycle Agile ceremonies, 2-week sprints and things like that, are really designed around discovery and being able to react and adjust as the discovery is made. They acknowledge that we don't know everything at the beginning. And therefore, as we work, we're going to recognize and have a model for what do we do with the discovery that we're making and how do we course correct quickly. And that generally means planning and replanning and replanning and replanning, but in a very light way, so it's not a cumbersome or doesn't introduce a tremendous amount of extra overhead. In fact, I would suggest it reduces the overhead because most of what we do is done just in time. The decomposition of work, when we think about these big ideas and we break them down into smaller pieces that are more predictable, the way that the nature of that decomposition is done in a way that we say, look, let's not do more than we need to because we know we're going to have discovery. And so it becomes a much more dynamic model, and we can plan and then discover and then plan and adjust to what we learned. So what happens is I think our planning actually becomes more meaningful, more accurate, and how we can get to more achievable, a plan that we can lay out and ultimately achieve. Now, the other mitigating circumstance in the Agile methodology from a planning perspective is if we plan right and we do things like weighted shortest job first, to be able to put the work in the order based on a stack ranking that says the things at the top of the list have the greatest potential benefit, generally in the shortest period of time. And that's as a side note, that model says we're not just going to go with the thing that has the most value, because it could be something that takes a long time to do, whereas the next couple things in the list may have a little less value, but in aggregate, cumulatively, in the same period of time, we would get more value than going after the one big thing that seems to have the most value. So smaller things in aggregate may have more value than the one big thing. But once those things are in order and we're working down that list, the other thing that we're doing when we think about our plan is we're mitigating the risk of being wrong in our planning. Meaning, if we think we can do 10 items, and as we get into it and discover, look, we only got 7, which is not an uncommon thing in any of these methodologies, is coming into situations where we were wrong in our estimates, or we thought we knew what we knew and we didn't. But when we delivered 7 things, we delivered the 7 most important. The 3 things that we didn't deliver were the least important things. And so we make decisions in Agile on release on demand, and so we sort of decide when we have enough value to be able to go out and make it available to our customers too. So there's into how we do this. It's not just this sort of black and white idea of coming up with a giant list of things we want to include, and then success or failure is that we got every single one of them done by some made up date. So that model, from my perspective and my experience, is a recipe for disaster. Coming up with scope and time and fixing those, while your resources are also generally fixed because you have the people you have. So that's a recipe for disaster. And in fact, in the Agile world, we lock our time boxes into some type of cycle. Our resources we recognize are generally fixed. And so scope is the variable, right? And so we work hard to make sure our backlogs are sequenced in a way that is appropriate for the uncertainty around this creative endeavor. But then we plan, and then we replan, and we replan at smaller increments so that we are constantly course correcting. It also means that the duration of time that can pass without the course correction is much shorter than in, say, a waterfall model. We're able to make course corrections, and we are able to keep ourselves on course towards the best solution by making these smaller course corrections and smaller planning. So the idea that Agile means no planning is false. In fact, Agile generally means more frequent planning. It certainly, from my perspective, means more accurate planning. And if done well in conjunction with well-groomed backlogs and sequencing activities that are based on things like weighted shortest job first, it really reduced the risk related to predictability and estimation and delivering the things that will impact and drive business results. So Agile means no planning, in fact, false. The second myth I want to talk about is this idea that Agile is only for software development. So I want to tell a story that I think helps illustrate or sort of debunk this myth better than some others. When my family, my wife and I and our kids moved to our current area, my brother was a builder, so we were very involved in the build of our house. And I remember being in the house one day when someone was working on putting cabinets in, and me being me, I asked if I could help. I'm not very good at sitting around and watching work happen. So I asked if I could help, and he said, "Sure. Why don't you take the handles and go put the handles on the doors, or on the doors, or the drawers, I think it was." And what I realized when I went to put the first handle on was that the handles didn't match the holes. And the reason was, when the installer had created a template to drill the holes, he created the template, and then he went and drilled all the holes. And if he had just drilled one and then finished the exercise, finished one whole drawer, he would have identified that there was a mistake. There was a mistake in the template. But this idea of working in horizontally in these layers, where we're going to build the whole database first, we're going to then build the service layer and build these things in these layers, and we really don't get to end functionality until all these things are in place. The change to Agile, which says build things vertically and build things in small working slices and then iterate on that, would have applied here. So finishing one step in the exercise would have prevented the problem. And luckily, we just got bigger handles, so it worked out okay. But you can see how that iterative model can apply to installing cabinets. We did transformation over the years for groups that may not be a typical adopters. We've done IT, which in many cases may be commodity-like work. Things like rolling out Windows 11 to thousands of terminals, right? So we came up with ways to do that in an iterative way. And like the cabinet install, where we would ultimately do a handful of things completely, have some discovery and learning from that process, and then apply that learning to the next set we did. And by the time we got a quarter of the way through, our efficiency on doing that particular thing had improved greatly because we were learning how to do it and coming up with better ways to do it. And then, rather than sort of coming up with a point solution and say, well, this is how we're doing all of these thousand, just sort of repeating that without any continuous improvement, would be sort of an opportunity missed. Right. So Agile, the idea that Agile, or the myth that Agile applies only to software development, isn't true. I heard a story once that I think was very funny, of a woman who had scrummed her wedding. So had taken an approach to planning for this event that is, for many the most important day of their lives, and using these things, these practices to plan for it and execute it. So I don't know the details of how it was done, but I think it's just anecdotally an indication that you can use this for things other than software development. We also, by the way, do Agile transformation and Agile practices for service delivery. Whatever your product is, these same things can apply to delivering your service well, or implementing a product, or even how you might choose to approach servicing and supporting a product. So false for sure that Agile is only a software development model. It certainly started there, but because of its success, it has grown well beyond that. And the same is true for things like Lean, where Lean starting in manufacturing, conceptually the idea of flow and reducing waste and things will apply to any practice or process. Lean, and Lean being sort of one of the other primary foundations of say, scaled Agile, all this stuff is baked into that. Okay, the third myth, Agile means no documentation. I remember in a training course that I was delivering with a very broad group of people, talking through the Agile Manifesto. And the portion where we have, the sort of the four core values, one of which is working software over comprehensive documentation. I recall either a leader in quality or a leader in regulatory about losing their mind when I said this, because they just couldn't conceive of the idea that we would value working software over comprehensive documentation. Right now, the response to that very quickly was, look, understand, in the Agile Manifesto, we're not saying that we don't do both of these. We don't value both of these things. We simply say we value these things on the left more, working software over comprehensive documentation. And some of that is really to mitigate the risk of putting too much stake or emphasis into documentation, sometimes on the front end. I remember many times back in the old waterfall days and the 18th month projects and things, having massive requirements of documentation, which really, until we started building it, until we got to see it, touch it, feel it, it wasn't real, right? And we'd get in there and if we, adhered to the documentation perfectly, which we would try to do, and the requirements, and then we build it only to find out this is not really what we need, right? Because it was conceptual, it was theoretical, but once it becomes real, once it's actual working software and people can touch it, feel it, see it, suddenly it changes. Right? Well, this is not exactly how I pictured it, but now that I see this, now I've got lots of feedback, lots of things that we think we should do differently, or this is sort of goofy, or this works really well. Getting quickly to working software so that you can get that feedback, so that you can iterate to the best possible solution, is one of the sort of key values here. The documentation we talked a little bit about the front end stuff, but on the back end too, having worked a long time in regulated industries and healthcare and things like that, where documentation is critical, particularly from an audit and regulatory perspective. These are work products, right? So, your work product can be whatever it needs to be, right? It's certainly code. It's, if you're writing software, it's code. If it's a service, it's your service delivery, or this, whatever elements of your product are. And documentation, if it may be, regulatory or quality or instructional or things like that, are all just part of the work problem. And the only advice I give on that is that these things should be approached the same way, right? All of this is part of your product, and as you're building iteratively, build your documentation in the same iterative way that you do your working software. Okay, bit of a side note, but it's you make it part of the product, and therefore this myth that Agile means no documentation is simply false. Okay, so the next one is the last myth to cover is Agile is chaotic and unstructured. Right, Agile teams do whatever they want, and that is also completely untrue. Now, the truth is there is a desire in Agile to give teams autonomy with the recognition that while operating within certain guardrails, which I'll talk about in a minute, you want the people that are the experts in this to have the freedom to do things the way they know is the best way to do it. You want, move many decisions down to where the information lives. You often get better decisions because these are the experts on those things, but it's also much more efficient. The command and control concept, which would push all the decisions up the chain and then back down, is really, really inefficient, especially when you're talking about scaling and large organizations. You just can't do that. You have to push much of that down to teams that they're empowered to be able to move quickly and make many decisions. But at the same time, it's not in any way unstructured or ungoverned, right? And again, this to me as a safe transformation and agile transformation and coach person is all about how you implement this. If this stuff is implemented well and you have the appropriate guidance, you've got vision around what your strategy is and what success looks like, you're able to connect that strategy at all levels, from the very top to the individual contributor, and methodologies like SAFe specifically do that. And then you have, at each of these levels, you have guardrails, right? So at the Agile release train level, you've got well-defined features, which are connected to well-defined epics, your major initiatives. And then under those features, you have stories that the teams are doing. So what happens is, as teams build stories under a feature, there's the guidance that the feature is providing. We have definition of done and acceptance criteria that says what success would look like for the feature, but specifically how many of those things happen, there's freedom to do at the team level. So there's a lot of autonomy for that. And there are guardrails like standard operating procedures and their definition of done and things like that require that everything you build fits within a certain sandbox. So there's absolute governance there. But within standards, there's still quite a bit of autonomy, and that's a good thing, to let your teams figure out how to do it best. And then you've got, again, from a decentralization perspective, you've got more efficiency and many more people who are participating in the design and the innovation, as opposed to someone up the chain who's having to do all of that, which is not efficient and maybe not close enough to the work and the experience to make the best decisions. So Agile teams definitely don't do whatever they want. They're driven strongly by their backlogs, right? Now this is a potential flaw in implementation you have to be very careful about. You have to get to singular backlogs, and you have to eliminate this idea that there's shadow work happening or work that's not going through the backlog, in which case, then you sort of lose. Maybe it is then unstructured and chaotic, because if they're just doing reactive work to the loudest, the voice that's sort of coming in and interrupting and saying, I need this thing for this customer, it will undermine this system big time, right? So, but if you follow the system well and you're working exclusively from backlogs, and these backlogs, while they can be agile, they can be changing as needed, which is part of the agile model. There is a real structure to it that ensures they're working on the right things at the right time. They're working with historical evidence that helps us make accurate predictions on what it should take for things to be delivered, while still giving teams the ability to be creative and autonomous. And by the way, things like autonomy and purpose and mastery, they help teams feel engaged and ownership and accountable, and they work better and they do better products. So providing that level of autonomy, not unstructured or chaotic, but that level of autonomy within a risk-averse environment with certain guardrails is the right recipe for teams to be really innovative and really productive. So those are the four myths. Agile means no planning, not true. Agile is only for software development, not true. Agile means no documentation, not true. And Agile is chaotic and unstructured, also not true. So let's move into some arguments against Agile. So maybe the first part was easy. Maybe everybody knew that the answer to those would all be false. But let's talk about some of the things that I hear there are detractors in every transformation. And then whether it's Agile transformation or any kind of major change management is probably the hardest part, because people are people and change is difficult, and people feel comfortable with what they know. And so you're introducing that maybe they don't know. It's scary, and they don't see their place in it. And there's all times, people that may push back overtly, sometimes covertly, right? People may sabotage these things because of fear and losing sort of this idea of, I know where I exist today. I know my value. Maybe, I see it all the time, sometimes senior folks who are the experts on things don't like the idea of getting to more a team model where everybody sort of leaves their title at the door. And they're a team member as opposed to the senior expert that everybody goes to, right? There's a job security, I think it's maybe perceived more than real. The security that I'm the expert in this, and therefore I'm indispensable. And of course, you don't want that. You don't want single point of failures anywhere, and you want that knowledge to be shared. So the idea is that there's detractors and there's often pushback on any kind of major change. And that's one of the biggest challenges around doing transformation of any kind, whether it's Agile or otherwise. So these are some of the things that I hear when people are pushing back on some of this stuff, right? Now, the first one I hear is, well, Agile doesn't scale. And I think there's some truth to that. This is not a myth that I can say, no, this is just patently false. There is some truth to that, which is why it's so important that you do it right, the title of the podcast. And one of the things that we talk about when I'm doing SAFe training in one of the curriculums, usually I think it's the leading SAFe curriculum, we talk about, here's the Agile Manifesto, and here's the 12 principles of the Agile Manifesto. And looking at those, how many of those do you think scale on their own? Meaning this idea, how many of those do you think scales on your own? And how many of these don't scale or would need some level of modification to scale? So the reality is, sort of spoiler here, they don't all necessarily scale, right? Here's a good example. The idea of the participation. So in the Agile Manifesto, and I don't recall the exact principle, was essentially that business owners or stakeholders or customer representatives, the stakeholders are participating. They're shoulder to shoulder with the group, able to represent, sort of a co-development concept. Well, the reality is that's not reasonable. You don't have enough people. You can't get a customer or a business owner to sit in with, for example, we had 80 teams in one of the business units when I was with working with Philips. You don't have enough people to do that. So that doesn't scale. When you look at a framework like Scaled Agile Framework, whose primary function was taking these successful Agile team methodology, whether it's Scrum or Kanban, and figuring out how can we get the same benefits at scale in large organizations or medium organizations, right? So, the answer there is you start to see some of the SAFe layout where you have product owners who are representatives of a customer rather than the customer actually being participating, or representatives of business owners. And then you can, go up a level to an Agile release train, which is a team of teams. You have a product manager there. And so that you see that those things, those roles and those relationships that are designed to take this stuff that may be a team level practice and be able to scale it. And if you follow the model, this stuff, SAFe itself, full transparency, Atlassian is a SAFe partner. I've been doing SAFe training for years. I'm a firm believer that it is a terrific framework, so you'll hear me promote it often. If you do it right, it scales very well while preserving the Agile principles that have been proven to be so valuable. So it can scale. It can scale. And things like SAFe and LESS and Nexus, these models for scaling are designed to make it scale. And they are everywhere. Right? I think SAFe is the number one most adopted scaled model in the world. But I know LESS and Nexus are all very popular as well. But these frameworks do work, so it absolutely can scale. This second argument is Agile is too expensive. And again, I don't really sort of know where that comes from. I know this certainly always as a consultant, Agile coaching and training and transformation, these things can cost too much. And I think the challenge with that is, and this is something I deal with all the time, is that helping an organization work better pays dividends. It pays dividends without question. But they are, these are lagging indicators. It's one thing if you're selling something, the more you sell, the more you immediately see the top line revenue grow, right? When you're helping teams innovate faster, now we're producing things that maybe our customers want. We absolutely will see sales growth, but it's sometimes tougher to draw that direct line that says, well, all right, we improved efficiency by 10%. We got more innovation out to the customer faster. Therefore, our sales folks had better, more innovative and interesting and exciting things to sell on. And we had sales growth, right? Or we were driving innovation. So we are delivering faster, more predictably, things that maybe, automation or things that help us do more cost savings because we're doing more through our tools and we're reducing the overhead on many needed functions. So drawing that direct line is sometimes tricky. So things like Agile Center of Excellence and folks that are working on practice improvement and continuous improvement, those things can be sort of viewed in some cases as just a cost center. And the truth is that is not true. In fact, one of the things I like to say is that the Agile consulting, coaching, training, certification, all these things, it 100% pays for itself. It absolutely pays it with a significant multiplier if done right. It will drive speed to innovation, drive time to market improvements. It will drive quality improvements, which also helps ensure that you're not spending a lot of your time reacting to recidivism or things that are coming back in because they were not done right. All those things will go to better business results. The work we do in coaching around strategy and aligning your strategy to execution will ensure that you're driving the right outcomes. And those things, again, whatever your currency may be, if your sales growth or it could be customer outcomes, it could be patient outcomes, whatever your currency is that you're driving. What we do with these practices and aligning strategy and execution and doing it more efficiently and swarming the things that have the greatest potential value and getting them delivered quicker, those things will create better business outcomes. And it is a significant multiplier to the cost you might spend in some consultancy or coaches or, however you choose to get that knowledge and adopt and sort of drive culture change with these practices. So the third argument, Agile undermines leadership control, right? We coach all the time about the move from command and control to commander's intent. This idea that rather than tasking and sort of this direct governance, we want to build cohesive, high-performing, autonomous teams that can, that can go out and be hyper productive and given the right guidance, the right inputs, can produce great things. So does it undermine leadership control? Maybe if you think control is what we're really after, right? It certainly could undermine control. Again, command and control is what we're trying to move away from to commander's intent, right? It doesn't undermine the control, but it changes the way we do governance. We think about governance and guidance. So like the myth we talked about earlier about having people do whatever they want, that's just not true, right? So leadership in a well-implemented model here is providing strong vision. They're providing governance in the things we work on through connected backlogs. They are providing guardrails that could be budgetary capacity allocation and horizon investment, things that provide these guardrails to ensure that we're managing short-term and long-term risk. all of these things exist to ensure that we are doing the right things and that we've got clear visibility and control over our investment and that we're driving towards the right outcome. So there is as much, if not more, control in this model than other models. I would say there's more, but it's done differently, right? It's done through a lot of transparency. So we want to make things visible so we can see and understand what's going on at any given time. We've got metrics that drive the right behaviors. We've got metrics that tell us we're healthy and we're operating well. We've got ceremonies that are promote consistency and standard operating procedures. We've got collaboration and built-in quality that's baked into the way we operate. There's a lot of things here that help ensure we are doing things with some structure and control, okay? And with predictability and with the right focus. Okay, argument number 4. So this one, Agile doesn't work with fixed deadlines or budgets. That's not true, right? Now, it's tricky. This one is, I think, is one that I see all the time, and it drives me a little bit crazy. What drives me crazy is the concept where so many organizations, and I think maybe the motivation is if I set a date, it will urgency, right? If I set a date, people will, for lack of another way of motivating people, will set a date and then drive people to move heaven or earth to hit that date. The problem with that model is you can have spectacular teams, spectacular people, but if you pick something, you pick a date and you set a scope for a set amount of resources that is not reasonable, successful, talented, innovative teams could fail by no fault of their own. And that's not an environment that's sustainable. People don't want to be in an environment. You start to lose great talent. You lose the investment you made in people. You're losing your your reputation takes a hit with your customers. I know sales folks out promising things to customers without any real evidence that it can be delivered, or by doing that, I've seen situations where they make a promise, then all of a sudden everyone has to adjust to that. And when you're in a place where you really understand your backlog and know what has the greatest potential and the greatest profile for business success, and you're in that model, and then all of a sudden somebody makes a promise for something in a high-ranking position to where they have the authority to force it to happen. And next thing you know, as an organization, you're working on the thing that's the 4th, 5th, 10th, 20th thing in the list at the expense of the opportunity cost of the other things in front of it that would have made the business more successful, better outcomes. So again, the caution here is about setting fixed deadlines, but can it work? The answer is yes, it can work. And I think the key to it is really scope management, right? So, in some cases, there are reasons why you might have some set deadlines and especially organizations that are not yet mature enough to do lots of releases. Organizations that can release on demand, deadlines get much more pleasant and that's where the agile release train concept comes from. This idea is like a subway. If the thing you're hoping for doesn't make it in this one, there's another one coming 5 minutes behind it. You get on the next one. The deadlines are not as intense, I think, is the right word. But in companies that are not very good at that and they release once a year, you can imagine how that deadline becomes significant. Because if you don't get on this train, if you don't get your stuff out, you'll go a year before you can do it again. So, sometimes you have to live with these deadlines. And the key to it is really you still work the same way, but you simply need to manage scope. And if, again, the reality of a deadline is you've got to have some real predictability around what does it take to get into, once you get into that period, especially in highly regulated places where there's a ton of work that has to happen as you're nearing a release. And you simply need to have a lot of predictability to know when you've got to stop adding more scope, right? It's not ideal. It's not ideal, but it absolutely can be done. And my experience with companies that were in that situation, okay, we acknowledge that's where we are today, and then we work super aggressively around shifting things left. So we're doing more in cycle, reducing the overhead of whatever happens sort of at the end. So it's much more predictable. And we can, ultimately get more scope in, a lot more with automation. So a lot of those things to get, the shifting left has a big impact on the ability to be able to, and automation, to be able to start to release more frequently, and then deadlines sort of lose their teeth because you're continuously delivering value. On the budget side, fixed budgets, this is a when you move from project orientation to product orientation, which is something I coach on all the time, the budget concept changes, right? You're talking about funding value stream. So your budgets are fixed. We know what our investment is in a given year, although we promote the idea of dynamic budgets that we adjust a couple times a year. But you know what your budget is. It is a fixed budget. You have set teams, high-performing, long-lived teams, and you bring the work to those teams. So budgets are set in this model, and it's not to the detriment, but it's actually to the benefit of the organization, right? And the decision you have to make is ultimately how, sort of big do you create this pipe for the ability to deliver value consistently. If you want to deliver more things in the same period of time, and your backlog and the value you anticipate getting from it says if we expand the capacity, we'll be able to get 3 or 4 more of these things on our list, cut line, and you make the decision to make the pipe bigger so you have some additional throughput. But the budget is generally fixed, and that's not in any way a problem, okay? So Agile does work within fixed deadlines. And this idea that Agile can't meet hard deadlines is not true. And in fact, the other thing I would say here is that, look, we set in an Agile world and we're working in these cycles, 2-week sprints or, 10-week program increments. So you're setting these time boxes we set are really designed to help people get very predictable around what can I do? What can we accomplish in the next 2 weeks? What can we accomplish in the 10 weeks? The 10-week program increment, those are, deadlines. I don't like to use the word, but those are, these time boxes that we get very good at being able to predict what we can do in those. So Agile does do just fine. In fact, even better as far as meeting deadlines or working within time boxes and prioritization to deliver a value within specific constraints. So let me talk about a couple short list of things. I think I mentioned in the introduction here today, there was an internal Yammer post from a very outspoken product owner, and at the beginning of a transformation for a certain business unit, and was just railing against, say, Apple versus Android, right? There's, Star Wars versus Star Trek, right? There are people that have very strong feelings about different things and different methodologies. And there was a post that was just beaten up on SAFe pretty badly at the beginning of transformation, because there was a lot of communications that were going out from senior leadership about the adoption of SAFe. And ironically, too, this was a person who was a big advocate for the Agile model, who had made this post. But sort of personal bias was not a fan of SAFe because it's been part of failed implementation. That does happen, which again, for me, is a reason why I think that any of these things really require some expert help to not only do it right, to implement these things in the right way so you get the value from them, but also to make it, to help the culture change, because you want to make it sustainable. You don't want to go and spend money and implement this process only to have it all basically revert back to the bad habits that you had going in, because it wasn't sustained long enough for the culture to change and it to become truly the standard operating procedure, right? So there are lots of examples of failed implementation of any of these methodologies, because it really wasn't done well, right? So this person had been through some of these, I think, bad implementations and just had a bad taste for the framework. But he made the post, and there were some, made a lot of statements about it that I think would be a good. I'm going to walk through some of them, because again, we're really talking about today the sort of detractors and the things that people would say that would be arguments against some of this stuff, and trying to dispel some of that. But so the post started with the idea that portfolio management doesn't require SAFe, and that's true. That was not a controversial statement. There's no question that most organizations need this and don't have it. I think I wrote an article about lean portfolio management on the Elastion site that talks about this is the thing that's just got a huge impact to top level business success and business outcomes, and is missing because a lot of folks think that Agile is just about implementing with some of your software tech teams, and it sort of stops there, but then you never really connect it to the business the way it really needs to be. So this stuff is missing. And this person who made the post recognized that we needed portfolio management. But his point was, well, we don't need SAFe for that. Okay, you're right. You're right. Now I'm a fan. The lean portfolio management competency within SAFe is really, really strong. The mechanism by which you define and manage your strategy, the way you manage your portfolio vision, the way you connect that through lean startup practices to the initiatives and the epics that you're building, and of course the SAFe framework that exists where epics are broken down into features and stories, and the connectivity is very strong. And of course, it's derivative in lots of ways using weighted shortest job first, which we talked about last week a little bit from Don Reinert's book, Principles of Product Development Flow. All those things are baked into it. So the SAFe lean portfolio management competency is very, very strong, and I highly recommend it. So not a controversial point, but there's other portfolio management mechanisms that they're all largely around sort of doing the same thing. The second point was SAFe is anti-agile, too prescriptive, top-down command and control. And I can only assume from the statement there that this is just a bad experience in the implementation, because again, command and control is the opposite of what we coach on in SAFe implementation. And again, I've talked about this earlier in the segment here about the guardrail model, but the autonomy model that is here. So it's absolutely not top-down command and control. Is it anti-agile? No, I don't think so either. And again, some of this comes down to, as you scale this model, there is connectivity. There has to be connection to the top-level business objectives. And you're now talking about, the largest initiatives and how those things then get broken down, across multiple teams and multiple businesses and lots of dependencies. There's no question that there's some structure to that. And has to be for these large scale initiatives. Is it prescriptive? Yes, in some ways, right? But even Scrum prescribes specific ceremonies, daily stand up, sprint planning, sprint review, retrospective things. There's certainly ceremonies prescribed. There are roles prescribed, right? And that's important too, because we talked about how earlier in the segment, making Agile scale requires certain things. Right. So some of the roles are predictive, but I've also found that thinking about large companies or even medium companies, many of these companies are coming from an old school command and control waterfall model, or maybe they're like Phillips with 160 years or whatever the number is of baggage is the wrong word, but of legacy practices. The idea that you're going to adopt a fully autonomous, everybody go use these principles and sort of do your own thing, that's absolute chaos. So having a level of prescriptability, I think, is important. And there's an expectation with these organizations that there will be some level of structure to it. But is it anti-agile? No, not at all. And again, if it's done right, giving the autonomy at each of the levels for folks to make the decisions that need to be made, or course correct, or refine their backlog within certain guardrails, I think it's not in any way anti-agile. The next point was SAFe focuses on long-term planning and predictability, not empirical short-term iterations. And that's simply not true as well. The long-term planning and predictability in SAFe is based on our empirical short-term iterations. The things that we learn around velocity, the mental models that teams are building as they produce things that become the basis for relative estimation, are creating the important empirical evidence that becomes the foundation for future planning. The other thing about the planning, and this is something I didn't say in the earlier segment, but I should say now, planning is one thing. It's modeling and being able to forecast. And we talked about the risks that, how we sort of mitigate by effective backlog management. So where if we do run out of capacity, it's the least important things that that don't get done. The idea that the idea that planning is a commitment. That's probably the best way to say this. That's the part that I think is important to sort of say out loud, which is this: only the next iteration is our commit. The rest of it is our model. again, this is just back to the point of the value of the short-term iterations. Those things are critically important. They will affect whatever comes next. The learnings, the changes to the evidence that would tell us what how predictable our plan is, how realistic our forecast is. All that is based on the short-term stuff. And we don't, if done right, we're not committing to this, a long-term plan. We're committing to our short-term iteration deliverables with a model that says if all things being equal, this is what should happen. And we're very good, by the way, at predicting what that will happen. But things may happen. The priorities may change for the business, right? So, and we're positioned well to be able to make adjustments as needed. That's part of the Agile model. So there's simply not true that long-term planning and predictability is trumping the value of those short-term iterations. It's based on the empirical short-term iterations. Okay. The next statement was SAFe is overly complex and bureaucratic. And again, I'm reading into, it's hard for me to sort of know fully what the exact thoughts were behind some of these statements. But again, if done right, with the right level of decentralization and autonomous teams, this is not in any way overly bureaucratic. Okay. Now, there is certainly participation required where we push for business owners to be participating. And one of the lean budget guardrails, one of the 4 is actual business owner participation. They're in the room at PI planning. They're helping us understand the business context for the next 10 weeks of the things that we're going to deliver. They're there signing off that this stuff we're working on is in fact the right things for us to be working on. So they're part of it. Now, I don't know if this is maybe a culture question. Having the bosses in the room is bureaucratic or is causing people to behave in a way that is inauthentic. I don't think so. Again, I've been in lots of PI plannings with leaders. I think again, it's just a culture issue, and done right, this stuff is not overly complex. It's certainly not overly bureaucratic. Okay. The next one was SAFe focuses on output over outcomes. And again, that's simply not true. SAFe measures 3 things. We measure outcomes, right? So we ultimately, when we're talking about epics, features, story, we write those to define the appropriate outcome we're trying to reach. It's all focused on it's got that focus, and did we achieve it? And if we didn't achieve it, how do we get better at properly reaching the outcomes? And in fact, we use things like lean startup to test our hypothesis sooner. So if this idea we have is not going to work, we know as soon as we can pivot to something else. So we are laser focused on outcomes and not output. And now I think there's always a concern. I think maybe some of this was around this idea that some organization will put KPIs and metric-based management in place. And we do believe in KPIs, and we do believe in metric-based management, but they're often misused. And when we talk about sort of the measures we create, the KPIs we create, they should be based on the behaviors we're trying to drive. And sometimes they are completely misused, and then they end up also being in many ways manipulated and things. So I think it is important to make sure your KPIs and metrics are appropriate for driving behaviors. And if they are based on some measure of output, I've seen places where some of the leaders want to take a velocity and say, "Oh, their velocity is 40 points. I want it to be 50," which is sort of ludicrous because this is sort of an abstract idea. And in some cases, if there's no normalization, one team's 40 may actually be more meaningful output than a team that's showing 50 points because their mental models are slightly different. So again, you can't use the metrics. You don't want to sort of use the metrics as a performance management tool and sort of manipulate those or create a model where you are focusing more on output over outcomes, right? And also the way you sort of manage some of the team's autonomy and how you write your epics, features, and stories and acceptance criteria that gives them the ability to have some flexibility around how they do it. In fact, if done well, can drive much better outcomes because they may know a better way to do something that's half the work and still achieves the value, or maybe even achieves the value in a better way. So there's no question that SAFe is focused more on outcomes and not output. The next one, there's only a couple more here. The SAFe disempowers teams and removes flexibility. So I think now we're getting a little repetitive in some of the things I've said already, but the flexibility, if done and implemented right with autonomous teams and decentralization and the appropriate guardrails, gives teams the ability to work with lots of flexibility in their space. And that actually would empower teams more than disempower teams, right? Again, giving teams purpose. They know what the value of their work. And so the connectivity from the top to the bottom that says, I know why I'm doing this thing. I know how this thing I'm doing affects patient outcomes. I know how it affects the business's top line and bottom line. I have purpose. I'm motivated. Autonomy says we, the team, have the ability to make many decisions on how best to do that, right? There's a lot of pride and engagement from teams in being part of an autonomous team with the appropriate level, guardrails that we've talked about already. And then mastery, right? So this idea of continuous improvement, which we haven't talked about, but in an agile culture, people want to get better at something. It's the reason why a lot of people will pick up an instrument, whether they are ever going to be out on a stage playing for people or doing more than just playing at home or around a campfire. There's a pride that goes with getting better at things. So those three motivators create teams that feel very empowered and are flexible. Okay, big tech doesn't adopt SAFe. Many companies are moving away from it. That's not been my experience. I mean, there's lots of big companies that have like to put their own spin on things. You've got lots of different sort of flavors of some of this stuff. Google's got a model and Amazon's got a model. Then you've got some of the big ones like SAFe and Less and things out there. But there's no indication to me that this stuff is not being adopted. And if it means big tech, Facebook, Google, Amazon, yeah, they have their own flavors of this and that. But that's not in any way undermining the value of this. Is just generally some sort of minor variation. Again, while I'm a big advocate of implementing SAFe in a way that is, as close to possible as the academic, because these are, this is something that's been implemented in lots of other organizations and been proven. And what I don't like to see is that because there is an adaptability to all of this, and I'm certainly allow for and encourage adaptability as you implement, but I'm a big fan of ultimately implementing sort of the way it's a little more close to the textbook way, and then adapting from there, as opposed to using the potential for adaptation to allow people, particularly some of the detractors, that will say, oh yeah, we're going to adapt it just to basically match exactly what we do today. So again, I think you have to be careful there, but I don't think this is true, that this is not being adopted. And then the last mention here was really talking about the failed things before that this person had been through. And again, I think that comes back to the quality of the implementation, the training and certification, so that folks understand the foundational principles and they can make the right decisions because it's not as prescriptive as this person would want to believe. Coaches to help teams, move it to the practical, be able to implement and do it and practice it and be able to sustain that long enough for it to start to change the culture, or to change the culture where we've done this long enough, it doesn't feel awkward anymore. This is the way we work. So those things are important to make sure an agile transformation is successful. So that brings us to the end of our conversation around debunking agile myths, some of the arguments against agile, and even some arguments against SAFe. I hope that I've given you things to think about. Maybe these are things that you've heard. Maybe even these are things that you believe. And hopefully I've maybe changed some minds a little bit. Again, if you're in a situation with your organization where you're struggling with predictability and struggling with time to market and motivating people, and maybe you're working on too many things and everything's taking longer, those should be good indicators that maybe it's time to call an expert and get some help, like what we do here at Atlassian. So I encourage anybody to think about that. If you like this podcast and you're finding it meaningful, we've got a lot more to share. We've got a lot of guests scheduled that have a lot of great insight in future episodes. So please make sure you hit the subscribe button and bookmark it and things like that, so you can get a notice when new episodes are being released. We're trying to do it at least once a month, maybe even twice a month if we can do so. So thank you for being with me today, and look forward to more of these episodes coming out soon.